us pray.
First,
Guide us, Lord, in all our doings, with your grace, with your favor, and further us with your continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and by your mercy attain everlasting life. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord.
amen.
Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou would be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most beloved Lord and Savior.
Amen.
Let us together say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father,
Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And now may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all, now and forevermore. Amen.
Amen. The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the Governor General. Announcements by Your Honor, the President. Presentation. You wanted it.
Excuse this. Senators, I have been advised that Senator Maynard, Senator Dr. Maynard will be late. I've been advised as well Senator Mr. Cummins to be absent, as will Senator Lucille Moore. Oh, minutes, yes. I received the minutes of our meeting held on May the 19th, 2021 for confirmation.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the aforementioned minutes be confirmed.
The question is that the minutes of a meeting of May 19th, 2021 be confirmed. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. Minutes are therefore confirmed.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the following documents: Pesticides Control Amendment Regulations 2021, the annual report and audited financial statements of the Student Revolving Loan Fund for the year ended March 31st, 2020, the annual report of the Barbados Investment and Development Corporation for the financial year April 1, 2018 to March 31st, 2019, the audited financial statements of the Board of Management of the Parkinson Memorial School for the financial years ending March 31st, 2008, March 31st, 2009, March 31st, 2010, March 31st, 2011, and March 31st, 2012, as well as the audited financial statements of Newton Business Park Project Company Limited for the financial years ending March 31st, 2009, March 31st, 2010, March 31st, 2011, March 31st, 2012, March 31st, 2013, March 31st, 2014.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate are moved by Minister.
Senator McConney.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45.2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that the Standing Order 45.2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Introduction of bills.
Senator McConney.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bills: the Grantley Adams International Airport Transfer of Management and Vesting of Assets Amendment Bill 2021 and the Company's Economic Substance Amendment Bill 2021.
The question is that the aforementioned bills be read a first time. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 5, in the name of the Honourable Minister of Science, Innovation and Smart Technology, to move the second reading of the Company's Economic Substance Amendment Bill 2021.
Senator McConney.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, Mr. President, as I rise to introduce the Company's Economic Substance Amendment Bill 2021, I'm reminded, sir, that we live in a world where we must cooperate and compete at the same time with countries large and small. I'm reminded too, sir, that not all competition is fair, that the big and economically mighty countries can and often do throw their weight around, creating policies and standards and practices and lists with a result that, intentional or not, can create a squeeze and a disadvantage to the smaller, vulnerable economies like Barbados's. Economies that are way too small, sir, to even cause a ripple in their scale advantage as it relates to trade and taxation and capitalization. And sir, I am reminded as I rise to introduce this bill that in a world of sometimes unfair competition, we as a small country have to calculate and manage our risk in the fights that we choose to take on. And we must also consider the benefits of the cooperation we choose to give. It is a balance, sir. And Barbados is constantly reviewing the cost benefits of this kind of cooperation that we will see here as part of this bill. And we are constantly building alliances so that we may continue to see our way through the fight. This government believes, sir, that the fight for Barbados's reputation as a good place to do business is worth our cooperation to the extent that we can do so without causing irreparable damage to our domestic interests. We want to ensure that our laws, sir, are aligned with global standards and practices and commitments that safeguard opportunities for Barbados's economic development. And so, Mr. President, the bill before this Honourable Senate, it proposes to help to safeguard some of those opportunities and indeed keep the reputation of Barbados at the level that we will feel good about internationally. This bill, sir, proposes a simple change to include partnerships into the scope of the substantive act to which this bill relates. Currently, sir, partnerships are not covered, so we are seeking to extend the definition of what is a resident company in Barbados at Section 2 in the current Company's Economic Substance Act to make it apply to to partnership arrangements, as well as to include a new subsection in D. Now, this Honourable House, Mr. President, will recall that on a long day and a late night in December of 2018, senators labored in this, well, it was another place, but it was still this honorable chamber, to approve the amendment, abolition, and enactment of a number of pieces of legislation. I believe there were close to 14 or 15 that we did all at one time, if I recall correctly. And we did that in an effort, sir, to bring Barbados into compliance with the base erosion and profit shifting program of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, what we call the OECD. Bottom line, sir, is that the OECD argued that companies that set up elsewhere outside of their borders and paid lower taxes in these other jurisdictions were eroding their meaning the OECD countries, that it was eroding their tax base, taking away revenue from them. And that was just the bottom line of that. Of course, it was far more complicated, but I have simplified it because that was basically what that was about. And this Honourable House will also recall, Mr. President, that Barbados's corporate tax structures, the corporate tax that we would charge to companies, etc., it was converged at that same time. And what do I mean by that? It is whether you were a domestic company or an international company, the tax that you would pay would be the same thing. Prior to that, sir, there were several cases in which different tax rates for domestic and for international companies applied. And that ended, sir, on that long day and late night in December 2018. Our action effectively, sir, brought Barbados into the OECD's what they call the low or no tax jurisdiction classification. And it also brought us into what was called Criterion 2 jurisdiction for the European Union. You would have heard me, sir, refer to the big and the mighty. These OECD and EU are some of those big and mighty countries of this world with whom we must cooperate and compete. Criterion 2, Mr. President, it provides that such a jurisdiction, any jurisdiction that fits that criteria, should not facilitate offshore structures or arrangements that are aimed at attracting profits which do not reflect real economic activity in that jurisdiction. Sir, that was a fancy way of saying that we can't have these shell companies in names only. Not that Barbados was ever in that business in the first place, but you know, sir, sometimes you get painted with a broad brush. That Criterion 2 said that once we have fit that criteria, which Barbados did, that we had to, that businesses that would benefit from our tax regime would have to have some substance. They have to be doing something. They have to be engaged in real activity that fit the criteria for substance. And this is the standard that a jurisdiction was required to have to be compliant. Sir, these classifications meant also that Barbados was required by the OECD and the EU to put economic substance legislation in place, and thus the substantive act to which I referred earlier. That act, sir, you will recall, came into effect on January 1st of 2019. And Barbados was also required to put in place effective means to monitor companies, I should say, that carry on the relevant types of activities. Now, sir, just to share a bit, some of the companies, some of the businesses that would be subject to such regulatory requirement would include your banking and your insurance and your fund management and your finance and leasing and your shipping, just to name a few. Sir, when we made that adjustment in compliance with international standards and requirements, we knew that these global standards will likely continue to evolve, to develop and evolve, sir. And so they have, because in 2019, the EU member countries decided to take a closer look at entities that had a legal structure of a partnership. And they wanted to look at them and see how partnerships that relate to economic substance requirements, how those partnerships were treated in different jurisdictions that would have fit the criteria. The decision, they discovered, sir, that partnerships were treated differently in different jurisdictions. And they therefore sought to bring all partnerships as it relates to economic substance under one treatment, regardless of where they were domiciled. They wanted to ensure, and sir, basically that's what was said, that they wanted to ensure that there was a level playing field among all. Now, sir, Barbados did not just say, okay, fine, let us go forward. Certainly, sir, there was engagement from Barbados. Barbados took the time to understand what was expected from us. We completed required questionnaires that were distributed to all jurisdictions to gather information about how partnerships are actually treated. And it was determined indeed that Barbados's legislation as it relates to economic substance needed to be adjusted. And so we are here. But I want to share with you, Mr. President and honorable members, that Barbados is not the only one. This is not something that is singling out Barbados alone. Indeed, sir, it must be noted that the requirements are also being applied to other jurisdictions to include partnership within their economic substance legislation from July 1st of 2021. There is an urgency, sir. This position was publicly confirmed in the text of a recent Code of Conduct report to the Economic and Financial Affairs Council of the European Union. And sir, some of those other countries, just to list a few: Anguilla, Barbados, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Guernsey, Isle of Man, and Jersey. Barbados was not alone. It was certainly a requirement extended to all. But sir, in order for partnerships to be deemed to be within the Economic Substance Act, they will have to satisfy three criteria, three additional criteria. And they're really tests more than criteria. One is the directed and managed test. That directed and managed test says that the company, the entity, must be directed and managed in the jurisdiction which would be Barbados, with regards to the relevant activity that it was taking on that will qualify it as having activity of substance. The second was the core income generating activities test, sir. The entity needed to demonstrate that the relevant core income, the activities that were generating their core income then, sir, that they were derived from relevant activity within that jurisdiction. And the third test was the adequate test, sir, that the entity would need to have an adequate number of qualified employees in the jurisdiction, which would be in Barbados in this case. They would have to incur adequate expenditure in Barbados proportionate to the level of their activity, and they must have adequate physical presence. And when we talk about adequate physical presence, we're talking about office space or facilities or something that demonstrates that, in fact, they are physically present here. Now, sir, partnerships that were deemed to be controlled, to be within the scope of our Economic Substance Act, but that were controlled by residents of Barbados and not part of a multinational group and carrying on relevant activity exclusively in Barbados, with income being derived solely from the activity, would be subject to a reduced economic substance test. And so, sir, you would see that the work that had to go into this, the adjustments that had to go into the journey to now has been one that has been long, it has been one of consultation, it has been one of working together, it has been one of making all the adjustments that we need to. And for those companies out there who are wondering, who would be wondering, sir, how would this apply to this? And not just companies, I'm talking about resident companies as it relates to partnerships, for example, sir. Because remember, this particular amendment we are seeking to bring would include partnerships in our current Economic Substance Act. And it speaks, sir, it says that there are certain times for compliance. So, for example, sir, the Economic Substance Act, it is based on the relevant fiscal periods for a resident company. And when I say fiscal, it's what you call your financial year, or that fiscal year in which you account. And, sir, it is different for different resident companies. And so the timeline for compliance of partnerships with the ESA, and when I say ESA, I talk about the Economic Substance Act, the Companies Economic Substance Act, is as follows. And sir, I ask your permission for me to read it so that I do not miss. For resident companies that have been in existence prior to the commencement of the Economic Substance Act, they must be in compliance from January 1, 2019. So, for example, sir, a resident company that has a fiscal period from January 1, 2019 to December 31st, 2019, and was in existence prior to the commencement of the ESA, they will be required to file their economic substance declaration for that year no later than 12 months after December 31st, 2019, which would have been no later than December 31st, 2020. Now here's the other situation. The resident company that was not in existence prior to the date of commencement of the Economic Substance Act, they must be in compliance from the date on which the company commenced activity. So, sir, for example, if you were a resident company, you had a fiscal period from January 1 to December 31st, 2020, but say that's your fiscal period, but you didn't start until June. You didn't start to the middle of the year of that fiscal period. Then you will file an economic substance declaration no later than 12 months after December 31st, 2020, which would be no later than December 31st, 2021. And, sir, finally, for resident companies that were grandfathered, and you will recall, sir, there were a number of companies that were grandfathered when we made the adjustments to the Insurance Act and the Financial Institutions Act and the International Business Companies Repeal Act and a number of other acts. All those who have been grandfathered, who are partnerships and considered part of the, well, once we pass this legislation, part of the resident companies definition. Those grandfathers company which have a fiscal period from January, say, 1, 2021 to December 31st, 2021, they will file an economic substance declaration no later than 12 months after December 31st, 2021. And so, sir, based on those fiscal periods, there are different compliance timelines, and I am sure that the relevant companies will consult with their expert advisors into ensuring that. But I thought that I should share it because I wanted to explain to this Honourable House that we were not simply telling everybody right now, right here, and we have thought it through, and there is indeed an ordered and scheduled process for that to be dealt with. Now, Mr. President, there's much more I can say, but I would want to say that sometimes, sir, as I conclude, that sometimes to play in a global economic playground, we have to observe the rules. even when we are not part of making them. And while the urgency for Barbados is to get our legislative house in order, certainly by July 1st of 2021, to meet the rules of play as it relates to economic substance and bringing partnership into the scope of the legislation, I wish to invite this honorable chamber to support the passing of the bill. And it is with these few words, sir, that I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator McConney. Senator Begin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to make a small contribution to the Economic Financial Act. Years ago, as I said, I would always remember when Barbados was first starting to get into the international business sector. I remember when former Prime Minister Tom Adams, he was very active. I understand that the legislation would have set up under a previous administration, but I remember specifically former Prime Minister Adams and a very prominent attorney, I don't want to call names, who were very active in the financial, in the international offshore business at the time. And my understanding is that we would have entered at that point in time, because you know, small countries always need budget support. And I believe we might have gone into an arrangement probably somewhere in the early 80s with the IMF. So you get international agencies like the IMF and the World Bank. They probably felt that small countries were too dependent on them for budget sustainability. And they would have encouraged small developing countries to set up the offshore sector to support their income elasticities. But it turned out that many companies based in the large countries, Canada, England, Europe, USA, they thought, well, this is a great idea to relocate some of their business to these offshore countries like Barbados. And I'm speaking here primarily of Barbados and not what happens in other offshore jurisdictions. And it turned out that this international business sector turned out to be extremely successful. And a lot of the revenues then moved from those jurisdictions to these offshore sectors, and so would have affected the economies of those countries. And I would say, as we would say in Bayesian parlance, then they get vexed and sought to dismantle the head thing that the IMF and the World Bank felt that we should do to support our revenues. And they sought then to blacklist countries like Barbados and say that we are involved in all sorts of tax evasions and set up all these instruments. And, you know, they labeled themselves then as the watchdog to patrol all these small countries now that were doing extremely well, because Barbados did very, very well in the international business sector. And a lot of these groupings like the OECD, the G7 and the G20, and recently, as you know, there was a G7 and then a G7+1 meeting, where they have now set a new tax rate unilaterally for small countries like Barbados. We changed our tax rate to 5%, and then they decide, well, it has to be 15%. A minimum rate of 15%. Minimum. And because they use the words minimum rate of 15%, it means that it can go higher. And when that happens, then these countries would think it would not make a lot of sense then for them to have offshore companies. And I think that one of the things that is being touted now is that these international companies should themselves then decide that they are going to incorporate locally and be taxed at the rate of 5.5%, so that they would be benefiting. So the whole idea with this global minimum tax rate is to shock these companies to bring back home the revenues rather than leaving them offshore. So once again, they set the goalposts, and when you are achieving the targets that they have set, they decide, well, here again, we are going to move the goalposts a little further. So countries like Barbados are always in a perpetual state of trying to meet new international regulations. And Mr. President, I would say that we have an international body like the United Nations, where all countries have one vote. That sort of regime should be discussed at a place like in the UN, rather than just between the seven of the richest countries of the world. And it's where each country has one vote, and they would decide what the action would be. So countries like Barbados have a remedy where we can go to the International Court of Justice and argue our points against this unfair taxation rates that is being imposed upon us. But the thing about countries like Barbados, who really have no clout on the international arena going to the ICJ, is that the big countries don't have to obey what they have to say. The results, if they rule in our favor, they do not have to obey what they have to do. And the thing is, what I find is that a lot of countries, they don't study countries like Barbados, and they listen to a lot of information that is disseminated from these organizations, who a lot of times when you hear what they have to say, they don't have a clue. And they don't have a clue. And if I were to even digress a little bit, Mr. President, and switch to something like the pandemic, the way that Barbados has managed the pandemic alone, you look at large countries like USA and United Kingdom, and these people feel that they have all the brains, to do all of these things. And they don't have half 1% of the brain of what our Prime Minister has. And they can't even manage a pandemic in their own country. But they want to dictate rules to other people. And that is what they have been doing with us in the international business sector, because we have a cadre of persons in Barbados and a lot of these countries who are very financial literate. They're very financial literate. I mean, I was looking at the discussion with the Prime Minister and Mr. Sachs, Professor Sachs. I mean, he was really angry about what had happened in his previous administration. But they make a lot of decisions that are so, yes, they make decisions in their favor, and you have a state like Delaware, Mr. President, that has a lot of offshore, and I would not say who represent Delaware. You can check it out for yourself. And they have a lot of offshore companies who do as they like. And if a small, tiny country like Barbados did the things like Delaware and Utah and all those states do, we would be worse than blacklisted. And I think there must come a time, and I see our Prime Minister doing it, more or less trying to encourage CARICOM leaders to come together, and let us come together on the basis to really fight these big countries that are bullying us, because that's what's really happening. It is bullying small countries like Barbados. And I think, to be honest with you, I believe she's making progress on that score, and I believe that one day that Barbados and other small offshore international jurisdictions will survive, and that we would be able to not do as we like, but be able to set our own ground rules, sir, Mr. President, and we would not have this type of bullying and moving of goalposts and that kind of thing in the future. So with these few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Biggins. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to lend my voice and to support the legislation. And this is, I suppose, out of a sense of recognizing that the country is really between a rock and a hard place, to use the proverbial term. The process of having to amend the legislation to the dictates of the OECD and the EU, I think is now well familiar to us here in the Senate. We've gone through this process a number of occasions, and we know that as time goes on, we're going to have other issues to face and to deal with. And I can remember several of those amendments going back from 2018 when I sat when it came to Senate. And all of this to really satisfy the OECD and the EU requirements, or face, obviously, the direct consequences of being placed on some blacklists or grey lists or watch lists from these organizations. And what is the reason for this? Countries, small countries like countries in the Caribbean, in Africa, and in Pacific, particular, we have been, and we have to admit it, it's known that we ostensibly facilitate international tax avoidance. And not, like I said, in avoidance and not evasion. And this has been a growth industry for countries like Barbados and other countries in the Caribbean, from perhaps starting in the late 70s into the 80s and going forward. But to understand the consequences of blacklisting, we understand that it would lend to us having to suffer various sanctions that EU member countries could then impose. For example, Mr. President, we could think of the adjusting of withholding taxes, which could have a significant impact on member countries receiving those profits. And we could look at other issues, other consequences as well. I think, sir, of the fact that it could affect our ability to access funding from international development lenders. And it, in itself, I suppose it could serve as a disincentive for EU multinationals to invest in blacklisted countries. So significant consequences for us if we don't. And, you know, Mr. President, the irony of all of this is that the real tax avoidance facilitators reside in the backyard of in the EU itself, Mr. President. If we think of countries like the Netherlands, Ireland, Luxembourg, they provide very favorable tax policies which are very attractive for the multinational, in particular the major technology companies. And so it should not be surprising that the Tax Justice Network has found that European member states account for 36% of global tax losses, as opposed to less than 2% of global tax losses caused by blacklisted or gray-listed jurisdictions. So why should small countries, it seems to me, why should small countries be blacklisted when we know where the real problem lies? And it should really seems to us in these jurisdictions in the Caribbean, in Africa, in the Pacific and so on, that there's a real great sense of unfairness simply because we can't retaliate. We can't retaliate against the might of the EU. And sir, to my mind, that is more reason why the African, the Caribbean, and the Pacific countries need to act in a unified way to represent themselves with a strong voice, speaking to those issues when we speak to those issues with the EU and the OECD. I was reading within the last few days the Tax Justice Network blog, and in particular of the 28th of May 2019. And just wanted to quote a note from that document. It says, the UK has effectively outsourced the corporate tax havens game to a spider web of overseas territories and crown dependencies, which opted to stay politically, institutionally connected to Britain after the collapse of the British Empire in the 50s and the 60s. Britain has full powers to impose or veto lawmaking in these places. Powers to appoint key government officials in these jurisdictions rest with the British Crown. Laws must be approved in London. These jurisdictions continue to operate in British courts and British legal systems, and are umbilically connected to and supported by the City of London and the British political establishment. The network satellite tax havens represent an extension of the City of London financial center. And these jurisdictions, which it goes on, it says include Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Jersey, the British Virgin Islands, enjoy some partial autonomy from Britain in certain areas. This half-in, half-out arrangement with Britain allows the City of London to benefit from often nefarious activities run out of these jurisdictions, as a corporate tax haven indeed evidence is, while allowing the British government to maintain distance when scams arise. So, Mr. President, we are being forced to do all of the dictates of the OECD and the EU. Yet Britain, yet many of these jurisdictions are the main culprits. In fact, another chart from the same tax justice network shows that the UK, United Kingdom, is the second largest facilitator of global tax abuse. And it goes down to list the others: the UK, Netherlands, Luxembourg, United States, Hong Kong, China, British Virgin Islands, Ireland, Singapore, Bermuda, and Switzerland. Yet, poor countries like Barbados and some of the other Caribbean territories are being held to ransom, as far as I'm concerned, by having to follow the dictates of the OECD and the EU. And Mr. President, call me the eternal pessimist. I have said in this Senate, I think before, that really and truly we're not going to see the end of these requests or these requirements to change our tax situation as we go along. And while we will always do it to comply, I really don't hold out a lot of hope for taxations, for the benefits of having international tax, of Barbados being an international tax center, is going to continue forever. To my mind, it's going to decline. And why do I say that? I think it's going to get worse, as I said, because, for example, it is known that in 2020, last year, the EU issued its tax priorities up to 2024, among which is a proposal to change the blacklisting criteria to widen its scope. The continual, the proverbial shifting of the goalposts. So that's going to continue. And, this widening of the scope is interesting. Could it be that soon we are also going to be required to adopt all of the environmental legislation which the EU decides we must have as well? In other words, can they start looking to other areas and attach these as requirements in order to be off of the blacklist? And that may not be as farcical as it sounds. Maybe we could they impose on us bits of legislation to deal with same-sex unions, in order to stay off the list. Again, I make that point because I remember, Mr. President, the then Prime Minister of UK, Mr. Cameron, making a comment. I wouldn't say issuing a threat, I would just say making a comment that if countries in places like the Caribbean and so on don't begin to change its legislation in relation to same-sex unions and those issues, that they may find themselves being unable to access funding or grants, grants perhaps, support from the developing countries. So those are the issues that could well be confronting us as the OECD broadens its scope in the coming years. We have already been put on notice, Mr. President, and just last week, or week before, I think it was, that the US is will be pushing to have a minimum global tax rate of 15%. Don't know if it will succeed. There are many different issues at play there. But the point is that we see more and more, and year after year, the several issues and requirements being placed on jurisdictions such as Barbados. And so, I just want to conclude by saying it's unfortunate, it's unfair, but here it is that we, in small countries like ours, we talk about sovereignty. You know, we speak about our sovereignty. We speak about having a local a head of state who is a Barbadian. We talk about republicanism. We talk about all of these things as though they are, you know, and I don't downplay or suggest that they're not important issues. But the point I want to make, Mr. President, is that here it is, we are talking about those issues, and yet we can do nothing about the serious dictates which we have to deal with, which are imposed upon us, and which can severely impact our economic standing and our ability to continue to generate and to broaden our revenue sources here in Barbados. And so I support the legislation. I hope that as we go forward, as I suggested earlier, that ACP grouping, and I remember the ACP, I don't know if it's still working, if it's still strong, if it's still being used, but I remember when it was set up to negotiate jointly with the EU. And you know, I hope that we can get back to having some sort of strong voice like that to try and make our case with one voice against these new economic colonizers. With that, I am obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Nurse. Senator Adams.
Thank you, Mr. President. And first, let me say from the outset, of course, I support this bill, the Companies Economic Substance Amendment Bill 2021. I associate myself with many of the remarks that have been made so far, especially from all sides, but from the side across there, the independents. Those who thought it important enough to show up today have made their opinions clear, and I think that's important. My remarks are going to be more general than technical. I think Senator McConney was fairly technical in her presentation. I think everyone is familiar with this tax competition battle that we have going on between sovereign states, you know, a cat and mouse battle. And as Senator Nurse said, it's something that goes on and on and on. It's no surprise that we're back here. I say cat and mouse, with Barbados cast as the the mouse for sure. I think in the way the debate often goes, I think what I'm going to call the tax haven nutters would say vermin rather than mouse, and that's the degree to which they want to fight this battle. But that's no surprise to us, really. We are used to being called tax havens, and all that is attempted to be inferred by that, the insinuations. We're villains for allegedly taking other people's tax revenue, and indeed sometimes we're described as morally deficient simply because of the design of our own tax structure. And if we wanted to get into a war of words, we could easily, and some have, start talking about colonial history and imperialistic, modern imperialism and all the rest of it. But really the argument is not there. It's not about villainy, it's not about vermin and all that. This is really about economic competition and the back and forth for supremacy. And in a way we're caught up in the battle, as Senator McConney said. We're just small fry in this argument, but we have to pay the price for when elephants go into battle. But I will say I'm more optimistic than Senator Nurse. I too think this will go on and on and on. It's an evolving battle. But every time we have to come back here and change some aspect of our tax structure, frankly, I actually view that as a little bit of a victory, because the rules are changed to try and stop us profiting, carving out a niche. They change the rules again when we're successful at adapting, and so it goes on. So I would suggest that it's tedious, but look at these things as small victories. So today, viewed that way, again, this is a bit of a small victory. But we have to play by these rules, even as we don't make them, as Senator McConney said. And pragmatically speaking, we have to do so in order to carve out the best deal for our people in difficult circumstances. That's why it's important to be here today, to make sure that this bill is passed into law before the deadline for that itself passes. And I'll come on to why that's particularly important in a moment. Now, it struck me in Senator Nurse's remarks that he talks about, I think, the Tax Justice Network. He cites them. They're very prominent in this debate. They often put out moralistically infused tomes against what they describe as tax havens and the thievery and all the rest of it that they consider is going on. They publish an account, such a tome, I think in October. That may be one that he quoted from. Barbados featured in there. It had its own little paragraph. And the thing that really stood out to me, sir, is they had actually invented data about Barbados' tax take. Now, in other places, what's the word I'm looking for? That would be called lying, right? This invention of the data. But they had a nice turn of phrase to cover that. They said that, they had used, and I'm very close to paraphrasing, they had used cutting-edge artificial intelligence algorithms that derived information from sources that they couldn't divulge but were reliable in order to come up with that data. That's a fact. You can go and look. They say it themselves. Well, frankly, sir, on those terms, anybody who wants to get on their Microsoft Word document, tap out an entirely unsubstantiated piece of garbage, can also say, provided they use spell check and grammar check, that they too use artificial intelligence algorithms to produce a document there, and therefore it should be given greater weight because of that. But it remains a lie by producing this stuff, and it remains untrue to fit the data to suit your conclusion, which is what tends to be happening. But through it all, even as new rule books are thrown at us, we pick them up, we look at them, and we adapt to the circumstances, because we know we have to get the best deal possible in a bad situation for ourselves. Now, sir, what struck me in particular in looking at this legislation, especially in the wake of our blacklisting debacle late last year, and I say debacle not because we are the ones responsible for it, because in this case it was the EU that was responsible for it. Senator McConney referred to the changes that have been made since this administration came to power, 14 adjustments to the legislation, all designed to match the edicts that were handed down by the EU. Now, the fact is we didn't quite make the deadline, so we got put on a pandemic. Now, that may sound reasonable, and I'll come on to that in a second, but what struck me, getting back to that point, what struck me with this legislation is the insignificance of what this Senate and the lower house was convened to do today and on Tuesday. And when I say insignificance, don't get me wrong. I mean insignificance when compared to the disproportionate response that we have suffered as a direct consequence, if you like, of this kind of change that's being demanded by us, that blacklist, the insignificance of it. So it's worth, particularly for the listening public who probably haven't had the benefit of reading through this 4 or 5 page bill, to set out the full extent of the change that we're here to make today, that one medical professional at least has had to come in from his duties to come and look at. So I'm going to quote the whole thing in full. Stand by. I'm going into, here's the quote. It opens now. This is the change. And includes a partnership formed in Barbados which is carrying on one or more relevant activities. Full stop, close quotation marks. That's it. 16 words. You know, you blink and you miss it. 16 words. Sir, when I read that and I thought we were being convened to do this today, I actually imagined the EU blacklisting commissioners. I know they're not called that, sir. I just imagine it that way. You know, they don't have an official blacklisting department carrying that name. But I imagine them passing over without comment a long list of jurisdictions, big financial services jurisdictions in their own neighborhood. You know, some of them have been called here today. You know, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Belgium, Malta, Ireland, Luxembourg, Channel Islands, even the Isle of Man, passing over all of those, going way down this list. Right near the bottom, they alight on Barbados. Now, one of the commissioners, I don't know who it is, Pavel or Vera or Pierre, turns to the other one, Gunter perhaps, and he says, you know, look at this, Gunter. Barbados, they left off partnerships from their legislation. You know, and Gunter says, look, pass me the blacklist and a pen. That's the way this thing goes. It's this kind of process that indiscriminately assigns countries onto a blacklist with consequences that the EU don't have to pay, completely out of proportion to what is being requested. Sir, this is, you know, the word blacklist really came into popular parlance because of the anti-communist Senator Joe McCarthy in the 1950s and the kind of rabid, indiscriminate accusations that were hurled at all and sundry that he didn't like. It might be anti-Semitic, it might have been blacks, it might have been Jews, it might have been gays, whoever it was got on this list. No due process, no natural justice, no clear right of appeal set out anywhere. A very opaque process, and that touches on a key point I thought that Senator Wiggins made, and I'll speak to that a little bit later. That, you know, these things are done with no particular consensual mechanism built into them. So, sir, that is the degree of economic competition we're engaged in. We have people prepared to put us on a blacklist, and the last time they did it, it was in the middle of a pandemic. Now, sir, being on a blacklist is akin to a financial death sentence. It means correspondent banks don't want to deal with you. Correspondent banks are the ones you have to go through for all sorts of international trade transactions, including the importation of medical supplies and equipment. That is the threat that these organizations hand down when they indiscriminately act fire before working out exactly what the context is. Senator McConnell used the expression broad brush. Doesn't matter who you are, provided you're on this list. Doesn't matter if you're not a zero tax jurisdiction. It doesn't matter. You're on a list. They're going to, regardless of circumstances, tick a box and continue the economic competition that we're engaged in. Well, so here's a non-AI algorithmically generated fact that we can rely on. Even before this amendment, Barbados had perhaps the strongest economic substance legislation of any country, anywhere in the world. And Senator McConnell took you through some of the technicalities of it. That's a fact. If someone wants to go and check it, anyone from the OECD or the EU or anywhere else, they can do so. Our tax revenues come from activity that is performed here. And that sentence is defined by these same rules that are foisted upon us by others. It's not our definitions, it's their definitions. We follow the rules even as they change, even as they are applied unevenly in the land of the the jurisdictions of the rule makers themselves. And my view is actually far more positive than Senator Norris's. I think that we will continue to find ways to prosper, to get through. And really, where I hang my hat in saying that is on the legislation itself that's being given to us. I think of a parallel. It may seem a little bit strange, but the parallel of civil rights legislation in the United States. You know, those litigators use the very law that at one time people couldn't imagine could be used for anything but to oppress, and turn it around, set precedents, and held those setting the law to account. Now, there's only so far rule makers can go in ignoring their own rules before they're compelled to obey them. And for that very reason, I think we are nimble enough to navigate a way through whatever is thrown our way and find success. So I just want to put into parentheses here, we've never been, you often hear this phrase from the OECD, G7, and so on about a race to the bottom. We've never been in that category, and Senator McConney made that clear. This isn't even about our 5.5% headline corporate tax rate. You know, we ultimately have to compete on a far wider set of criteria than that. Highly educated workforce, infrastructure that you can rely on that works, that might be telecoms, road networks, health, schools, government processes that work better than they do today. I think we've made quite a lot of progress on that in terms of digitization and so on. All these things and more, what they add up to is making this the best place possible to live in and to work in. When we talk about government processes, it's often in the context of business efficiency and facilitating business, but it has to be broader than that. This has to become a place you want to live in, you want to work in. We have to be perhaps a little more conscious of the environment that we're in, because that is a huge advantage that we have here. So tax is one part of this competition that we're in to attract businesses to headquarter here. Businesses seeking to undertake real economic activity from this jurisdiction. Now, I wanted to put that there in parentheses, sir, because you know, it's the human tendency to want to blame everybody else for one's misfortune. And it's important now that we don't do that. We're only victims here and trodden upon if we choose to be. We can choose how we respond to this, and we can gripe and we can groan, but we have to choose to respond positively, look at what they've sent back to us, and triangulate our way through it successfully as we've done before. We can do it again, and we're doing it today, albeit on a single change that, you know, the response if we don't do it is entirely out of order. Now, there's a slightly wider context there that Senator Wiggins touched upon that's important. A couple of weeks ago, the Group of Seven they made this announcement that would affect the global tax structure as it currently stands. And that's a tax environment that's been there since the 1920s, when the world was completely different. And really their announcement comprised two elements. And the first aimed to cover the 100 largest multinationals in the world, and aimed to do so in a way that they could not avoid taxes they've done up to now. They were going to be taxed in those jurisdictions where they generated sales and revenue. That was the basis of that part, that element of the announcement. Now, the second part, which Senator Wiggins spoke to, was this 15% minimum corporate tax rate that they seek to pass. Now, if all this does happen, and I think there are reasons to be doubtful that it will, unless significant exemptions are granted. For example, the UK has already made noises about exempting their financial sector in the City of London. Germany's car makers, I think, wouldn't be too far behind them, and even I can think of countries like France with very significant energy sectors that would probably also look to make sure they don't get crushed by this bus that's bearing down on them. But even if it is passed, I think we can still profit if we focus on those same traits I mentioned a moment ago, making Barbados the best place possible to live in. And that's including tax and all the other elements that I spoke about. You know, they continue to make the rules, we have to abide by them, but we can find the niche that they probably inadvertently are trying to deny us. But that 15% rate, now I thought a long time about that, because I can't think of an example in this cat and mouse battle in the past where we have had a specific percentage handed down to us. It may have happened, I just can't recall it, but 15%. I looked at that and I thought, it's especially ironic as an American proposal. No taxation without representation. I don't know how many people have heard that in here before. No taxation without representation. That's a rallying cry that sparked the American Revolution. That was a response to the British Parliament unilaterally imposing a level of taxation on their colonies without consulting the colonies themselves. No taxation without representation. And so we seem to be looking at the thin edge of the wedge where that is concerned, because the G7 countries are actually looking to do something very similar to non-G7 countries. Now, just in that vein, I saw a story this morning, it's happened in the last 2 hours, that the Department of Justice in the United States is going to sue the state of Georgia. It's going to sue the state of Georgia for trying to restrict the access it grants eligibility to vote in elections. And that's clearly being targeted, in the view of the Department of Justice, at minorities. The parallel is pretty strong. If they're going to sue someone in their own backyard effectively for no taxation without representation, and it's far broader than that, how is it that they can do this without seeking that same representation from all these non-G7 countries that they're going to touch? If they don't do that, this is an attempt to gunboat a 15% level on everybody. I have to say, to be fair, that 15% is really aimed at multinational companies. It's not aimed at domestic companies. So it's multinational companies. Wherever they're headquartered, they have to respect this 15% limit. Now, the counter-argument to this that we've heard quite a few times, but the most notable manifestation of that from the OECD, is that they have this representative framework. They call it the inclusive framework. That is the name, the IF, the inclusive framework, in which these very discussions that have been ongoing for a long time involve all members of this inclusive framework. There are about 139 member countries in there. But the fact is, sir, and this is a fact, that the vast majority of those countries, perhaps all 139 members, are observers only. They don't shape the discussion. They are there partly so the OECD can say they were there, that this was an inclusive framework. Senator Wiggins made a very, very telling point about the UN. There already exists in the UN a forum for international tax policy discussions. The UN governance network is transparent, it's tried, it's tested. Countries can band together in blocks to negotiate, or they can go it on their own to negotiate. The system is very well understood, and it stood the test of time. The OECD system was founded, I think, in 2015. It is opaque. It is unclear how you can make your opinion known, and really it does not serve the purposes here of finding a consensus. So when I look at this 15% wish that's coming down the line from the G7, and when I hear, as happened, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve hail that declaration as a revival of multilateralism, well, I laugh. I mean, it is so far from the revival of multilateralism as to be an absolute joke. What I hope, sir, is that in this discussion, all those large, stealthy tax competitors that we cited here before, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Channel Islands, the Spiderweb, as Senator Nurse described, the UK's post-colonial network. I hope that what they look at when they see this, and they understand clearly, this is, now we've transcended tax competition. This really is an element of economic sovereignty and political sovereignty. It is a country who decides what to tax at what level and what not to tax at what level. You cannot just hand down a 15% limit unless you reach it by consensus within a framework that is fair and equitable. That's the danger I see in that G7 announcement. I hope that those competitors who normally stay silent and catch a pass because they have greater real politic power than we do, actually wake up and look at that for what it is and start to engage the G7 and all the rest of them on forming a more consensual framework so that we can agree these things and not just have a clear attempt in my mind to transfer money from the poor to the rich, almost like a money grab when we haven't made any kind of agreement to that end. So, sir, that's the multilateralism I would like to see, that everybody recognizes this for what it is and that we face up to what is really a tyranny of hypocrisy that's been ongoing for a very long time. So I support the bill, sir, and I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Adams. Senator Greenwich.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to make a very short contribution to the discussion and debate on this economic substance bill. I believe that I'm going to be shorter than the other speakers. This economic substance bill today deals really with just the inclusion, to include partnerships and to bring partnerships under the umbrella of resident companies. And that's all it is. And really and truly, we cannot help but reflect on the recent number of impositions and dictates which have been thrust on us by organizations such as the European Union and the OECD. So those of us who have put our hand in that pool called law, I call it a pool because, sir, I do know that there are some lawyers who push their hands in it, move the hand around, and they felt something, and that was called criminal law. And there's some lawyers who practice that and nothing else. They don't touch anything else but criminal law. Some have put their hands in that pool and they've tossed it around and they felt something called contract law. They just deal with that. There are some ladies at the bar now who do absolutely nothing else but family law. They love it. A good friend of mine, he does nothing else but real property, buying and selling of land and so on, anything to do with land. I'm sure that if the good Senator Franklin had to do anything in this field, he would specialize in labor law. He would specialize in labor law. And why do I say all this? I don't want to go on to talk about revenue law and constitutional law and all the other aspects of law. I say all of this because I want to make the point that there is a branch of law called international law. And that is the point I want to reach. And international law is a branch of law that regulates the relationship of nations to one another. Now, I've heard mention of it by more than one speaker in the debate. The key judicial arm of international law, the one that is used to settle the disputes among nations, that chief judicial arm is the International Court of Justice. if any nation state in this world considers that it is being unfaired by another state or by another group, such as the OECD or the European Union, that nation state is free to ask the assistance, to seek assistance from the International Court of Justice. Sir, all member states of the United Nations have agreed to be bound by the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. They're bound by the jurisdiction, they're bound by the decisions, they have agreed it. Now, small states seem very reluctant to seek the assistance of the International Court of Justice for fear of being squeezed, for fear of retaliation, for fear of being the martyr in the cause. And we cannot blame them. Some of the dictates handed down to us have been nothing short of domineering, nothing short of browbeating, of bullying, of tyrannizing small developing states. And I do believe, sir, that the time has come when we, as a nation, perhaps join together with our regional partners, and we should urge the International Court of Justice to rule and to declare that certain rules and regulations and certain practices which are being imposed on us by these organizations are unlawful and unfair. And let them be aware of the fact that these impositions cause tremendous injury, financial injury, and injustice to small developing states. Now, sir, I would not say many, I would have to say 100% of those restrictions and regulations which have been inflicted on us now choke our ability to make meaningful profit in the area of international business. And Barbados cannot continue, Mr. President, to take these harsh impositions like an obedient child. I remember, sir, when I was could have been about 14 years old, I gave my mother some lip. And as cool and as calm as possible, she said, "Go and cut a switch." And I did it like an obedient child. And I came back, and that same switch was used to beat me. And this is nothing different. We comply and we comply and we comply, and we are beaten by the switch. Now, sir, I spoke recently to a director of a small international offshore company. And he was running through with me the kind of areas from which he can see his company having to pay, and having to pay government, and having to pay worker here and there. He said they pay registration fees. There's secretarial duties and secretarial expense fees and expenses to be paid. Directors' fees. bank transfer fees, management fees, audit fees, and a couple more he mentioned as well. But, sir, he said a relatively small company like his can easily bring into government's coffers every year about 30,000 Barbados dollars, easily. He went on to say that that figure can be doubled in some cases, trebled and even quadrupled in some cases, depending on the size and the level of activity of the company. So, let us therefore say, sir, for the sake of simplicity, that you have 100 companies doing business in Barbados. These are in the international area, international business area. And that Barbados makes $50,000 annually from each company. But now, because of this EU straitjacket impositions, we are only making $15,000 from each company. So notice the gap, though, between the 50 and the 15. And if you get hurt like that 100 times from 100 companies, and that's a conservative number, you could imagine the financial hurt that we experience. The point is, sir, Mr. President, that we must let those organizations such as the European Union and the OECD, we must let them know how their impositions are affecting us. And we cannot let them get away by saying, we did not know the pain we were causing you. We just have to let them know. And sir, not only Barbados, but other islands in the Caribbean as well believe that protesting, and I know that Senator Adams said he is not the outright pessimist in this regard. But yes, sir, there are Barbadians and there are others in the region who believe that protesting will not mean anything. That's their view. They believe, sir, that the nail that sticks up will get hammered down. There's the fear, Mr. President, that the International Court of Justice will rule in favor of the powerful countries anyhow. I may have a different view, though, but that is how some believe. And that fear, of that the bigger country will be massaged and that the smaller country will be trampled is very real. It is very, very real. Only 2 days ago, I was speaking to a good friend of mine, and yours too, sir. Good friend. In fact, he told me I could call his name, and I know you wouldn't object to my calling his name. Our good friend by the name of Erskine King, former director of sports in Barbados. And we reminisced of the Sydney 2000 Olympics. And we had a boxer, Barbados, by the name of Sean Terry Cox. And he came up to box against a youngster from France, well built. And let me tell you the truth, sir. Our man, Sean Terry Cox, beat that Frenchman from beginning to end in 3 rounds. Every part of his face, Sean Terry Cox went to work on. I mean, beat him badly. Sean Terry Cox landed at least 35 solid punches in that fight, as compared to 6 or 7 landed by the Frenchman. And you know, I was there. I was not. I was the Minister of Sports, but if I had to call the rank, Sir Gary Sobers was there, Mr. Steve Stout, Mr. Erskine King, and then I would put myself 4th or 5th in terms of the ranking. But we had a good crowd there watching this fight. We were now getting up to celebrate. And the result, the winner was from France. Now, I was so surprised, but pleasantly surprised though, that the entire auditorium booed that decision. People from Greece, from Tunisia, from Afghanistan, all over the world booed that decision, and they were booing for as long as I have been speaking. I mean, it never settled down. They could not believe it. So when you hear people say that they do believe that the small country is going to get squeezed, it's very real. It is very, very real. And one of the things at the back of people's minds in all this is because the bulk of the funding for that International Court of Justice is by the same big countries that you're fighting against. And that's a crucial point. That the resources that will keep that court to the level that it is at comes from the big countries. You see, sir, we cannot forget that this world is about the survival of the fittest. That this world is about the survivals, very often, of those who are most ruthless. And not only that, sir, small countries like Barbados will have to fork out large sums of money that, quite frankly, at this stage of our development, we do not have in order to get before the International Court of Justice. And as I have said, sir, there's always that possibility, always that chance that you will lose your case. You'll be throwing away money, which in truth and in fact, you really don't have. So for the time being, sir, small individual countries will simply have to comply. Will simply have to comply. What else can they do? Barbados by itself is like a grain of sand on a 7-mile beach. Nothing more. A little grain of sand. Sir, it would be a bold action for, I know people have called for it, but it would be a very bold action for Barbados to attempt its protests alone. Would be extremely bold. I read what Minister Toppin has said, and I want to just make one sentence or two, perhaps, about Minister Toppin. You and I know, so we've worked with him. Let me tell you something. When I was a minister, I had certain aspects of my ministry that, quite frankly, I wasn't comfortable with. I did it, I did the work, and I did it competently too. And I know ministers at the same time who had portfolios that they weren't comfortable with. But sir, Minister Toppin has fitted into this particular ministry and has taken to it like a duck takes to water. He is extremely confident, and he loves this particular area. He loves it. And if ever there was a perfect choice in placing a minister, he fits into this particular ministry. Like that, when you come to the end and you say, and you finish a puzzle. He loves the area. I think he's a little underrated, underestimated in this country as a cabinet minister. Excellent minister. He loves this. He loves this area. Sir, I read what he said, and I agree with him in his call for a unified Caribbean approach to this problem. Indeed, sir, as I listened to the speakers this morning, I heard Senator Adams make the same point, Senator Nurse, Senator Wiggins, Senator everybody makes the same point. A united Caribbean approach, rather than trying to do it alone. That, as Senator Nurse said, we should speak in one voice. And I think, sir, that if we do that, it will send a much stronger message to the European Union and to the OECD. And it will let them know, sir, that we as a region are serious, very serious, about the stance we are taking in these matters. It would also, too, sir, significantly reduce the cost. It would assist with the legal costs of going to places like the International Court of Justice. That cost would be shared. But, sir, as we know, the EU and the OECD perhaps do not care now. And perhaps with a unified Caribbean approach, they still may not care either. Mr. President, I see this as a fight against wrong. And I suggest that we say, as a region, that we say what we have to say, even if they do not take us on. Let us at least have it on record that we do not agree with these impositions that put us into a type of straitjacket. So as I wind up, so there comes a time in Caribbean affairs when keeping quiet is like betraying ourselves. Then, Mr. President, we as a region cannot be cowards any longer. This is a case, sir, where silence on our part is akin to being suicidal. Even, sir, though this may be a time when we are powerless to prevent injustice, we should never let it go down in history as the time when we failed to make our voices heard. It is better, Mr. President, to die on our feet than to live forever on our knees. I'm obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Greenwich. Senator McConney.
Well, Mr. President, I thoroughly enjoyed the contributions that were made by our various senators. We all seem to be in complete and total agreement that indeed, while this is something that Barbados needs to do at this time, it is something that as the goalposts change, as Senator Wiggins would have pointed out, that we need to continue to fight against the wrong, as Senator Greenwich would have said. And sir, I will not take the time of the Honourable Chambers to go over all of the contributions. I think many of them very much aligned. And I will now just, with these few words, beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Question is that this bill be read a second time. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Senator Committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself in committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do now leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 stand part. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has just reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that this bill be now read a third time. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Companies Economic Substance Act 2021. Amendment Act 2021.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be so cited. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This bill is now passed.
Thank you.
Order number 1, sir. In the name of the Honourable Acting Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Cap 225, to approve the lease of 2 parcels of land, property of the Crown, situate at the Pine in the parish of St. Michael in this island, to TAB Building Limited for use as a car park.
Senator McConney.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I rise to seek permission for the lease of these 2 parcels of land, which is in fact the property of the Crown that is situated at the Pine in St. Michael, to be leased to be leased to TAB Building for the purpose of use of a car park. It was determined, Mr. President, that by the Cabinet in its deliberations that this piece of land would be excuse me, sir. Would be leased at a rental of $29,141.80 per annum under the following terms and conditions. I will not go through all the terms and conditions, but I will highlight the most significant. That being that the lease would be for a 10-year period with rent reviews every 3 years and an option to renew for a further term of 10 years. And that, of course, TAB Building Limited would be responsible for the payment of all future rates and taxes or assessments, insurances, and other outgoings that are arising from the use of these lands. That the lessee would be responsible for ensuring that this property is used only for the purpose for which the lease is given, which is a car park, and that the government should indeed have the right and be allowed to inspect and view the property to ensure that it is being used for the purposes described. This TAB Building Limited had previously been a co-lessor for this property, and even though the lease at that time had expired, the company had continued to pay and is in fact up to date on all payments. And so now, as the company is seeking to have a new lease reinstated, we are now asking that this resolution do now pass.
The question is that this resolution do not pass. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This resolution is now passed.
Order number 2, sir. In the name of the Honourable Acting Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, the vesting of Crown Land situated at Lot A Wildy in the parish of St. Michael in this island, with the buildings thereon, to the Caribbean Development Bank, a regional financial institution established by agreement dated the 18th day of October 1969 for use as its headquarters.
Senator McConney.
Mr. President, the resolution before this House seeks approval for the vesting of 14,193.4 square meters of Crown land, the buildings and the buildings thereupon at Lot A Wildy St. Michael to the Caribbean Development Bank. The bank requires title to the land in order to upgrade and expand its facilities. The headquarters agreement, there's a headquarters agreement between the Caribbean Development Bank and Barbados, which was concluded back in 1970, and it says that to keep the bank's requirements for space under continuing review unless and until the bank assumes responsibility for such requirements, to make contiguous or other appropriate premises available to the bank as and when required. And therefore, we agree that as part of that headquarters agreement, that we would seek to ensure that adequate space is a part of the relationship. Subsequently, by conveyances subsequent to that agreement, that headquarters agreement, there were conveyances in July of 1983 and in November of 2009. This particular conveyancer would indeed now be the third parcel of land to be conveyed to the Caribbean Development Bank since the inception of the agreement. And sir, it is with this in mind that I beg to move that this resolution now pass.
The question is that this resolution do now pass. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The think the ayes have it. This resolution is now passed.
Order number 4, sir.
In the name of the Honorable Acting Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, the vesting in the National Housing Corporation of the parcel of land situate at Wake Park Road in the parish of St. Michael in this island for the public purpose of housing development.
Senator McCartney.
Mr. President, I rise to move this resolution to vest the aforementioned parcel of land in the National Housing Corporation, with the understanding that the government of Barbados remains very committed to this nation through our various policies and our various programs to provide housing developments in the low and in the middle income groups at affordable prices. And in fact, we are of the view that the proposed acquisition or the proposed vesting of this property will help in the National Housing Corporation, will help to satisfy some of the heavy demand for house spots and housing accommodation in the suburbs of Bridgetown. It is with this in mind that I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
The question is that this resolution do now pass. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This resolution is now passed. Hmm? Yeah. Let's move it. Let's move. Senator McConney.
Thank you, Mr. President. This now brings us to the end of government business for today, and I beg to move that the Senate do now adjourn. Senate die.
The question is that the Senate do now adjourn, Senate die. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. The Senate now stands adjourned.